Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me? Sure. Okay.
Allô? Oui, Hakim, bonjour.
Assalamu alaikum.
Bonjour.
Youssef, can you hear me?
Salam.
Can you hear me?
Ouais, je t'entends très bien. Donc, je commence la présentation.
OK.
Bonjour. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'avoir assisté à ce webinaire. Donc, je suis Youssef Alaoui, je suis directeur associé de Mobiblanc. Une petite présentation de Mobiblanc. Donc, nous sommes une société créée en 2010, donc aujourd'hui 2 ans d'expérience, et nous accompagnons nos partenaires, nos clients dans la transformation digitale. Aujourd'hui, nous entamons une série de webinaires autour du cloud AWS. Donc, on va aborder plusieurs thématiques. Donc, pourquoi le cloud? Pourquoi AWS? Donc, aujourd'hui, dans nos chantiers de transformation digitale, donc il y a plusieurs piliers qui sont très importants dans ce chantier de transformation qui concerne plusieurs secteurs. Donc, il y a de premier abord, il y a la méthodologie agile, donc, qui permet à des entreprises de mettre en place une feuille de route et de vérifier l'implémentation avec un rythme régulier. Il y a le DevOps. Le DevOps, c'est un mécanisme qui permet l'industrialisation et on va dire, et le lancement des nouvelles features de manière régulière. Et le troisième pilier, c'est le cloud. Donc, pourquoi le cloud? Le cloud, il permet de lancer des MVP. Donc, ce sont des versions minimales d'un produit, donc de manière très, très rapide. Donc, de faire du test and learn et d'expérimenter rapidement. Et le cloud, il permet également d'avoir un time to market rapide, puisqu'on dispose d'une infrastructure, d'un déploiement qui est fait de manière très rapide. Donc, il y a aussi le volet scalabilité qui sera le sujet de notre webinaire aujourd'hui. Donc, grâce au cloud, on peut absorber par exemple des pics de trafic, donc comme pour les banques, la consultation du compte bancaire à la fin du mois, comme pour les télécoms, comme quand on envoie un push de notification et qu'il y a des milliers qui accèdent à l'application, il faut qu'on reste sur une expérience utilisateur correcte. Et finalement, le cloud, il permet d'avoir accès à l'innovation puisqu'il met à disposition des briques intelligentes qui permettent d'écourter donc le cycle de l'innovation, notamment en ce qui concerne le traitement de la donnée et de l'intelligence artificielle. Et il y a un dernier élément qui est important, ce sont les compétences. Donc, pour faire le cloud, il faut disposer de compétences adéquates. Donc, de l'oppositionnement de Mobile Blanc avec ses partenaires. Donc, nous sommes partenaires de AWS et nous avons les compétences qu'il faut. Et donc, nous serons ravis de vous accompagner dans votre chantier dans vos chantiers AWS. Donc, pour ne pas trop tarder, je laisse la parole à Si Hakim, qui est un expert senior AWS, pour nous présenter la première thématique de cette série de webinaires. Merci. À toi, Hakim.
Merci. Thank you, Mr. Alawi, for the quick presentation about Mobile Blanc and the whole concept of AWS and what we're doing here. Thank you so much. And thank you to the people that joined us today. I know that you're pretty much busy people and you've taken the time to join us and to pretty much have, hopefully share some best practices at the end of this webinar and be able to implement that within the organizations accordingly. Now, with that being said, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Hakim Aghazal. I'm an AWS Solution Architect certified. I'm also an AWS DevOps Engineer Professional, AWS Business Accredited Subject Matter Expert, and a Machine Learning Specialist. And we've been having this beautiful partnership with Mobile Blanc in the previous year or so, in which we've been elaborating on different AWS projects within the Moroccan market. And today's webinar is mainly about showcasing the best practices that we've gathered and what we've been doing with the different customers that we had here within the company. So it's pretty much about, I would call it a best practices deck that we've gathered along the months and that we are happy to share with you. As you may know, sharing the knowledge is pretty much sharing the power. So without any further ado, let's jump into the presentation. Now, in order to do so, let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. See how we can do that. Okay. Right. Now, I believe the screen is shared, and in this presentation, basically, let's start with the subject. So the subject is mainly high availability deployment in AWS and how AWS managed to approach high availability deployment. So this is one of the most important topics when it comes to the DevOps arena field. It's very important. It's imperative to take that under hand and take that under the microscope when talking about deployment and CI/CD. Now, the agenda is quite simple. First thing first, we need to clear some definitions.
Hakim,
Oui.
Hakim, la présentation, on ne la voit pas.
Okay, give me 1 second. Can you see my screen though?
Je te vois, mais je ne vois pas la présentation.
Okay. Stop sharing the screen. Let me see again.
Alors, excellent.
Let's see.
Alors, je vois l'écran.
OK.
Donc, voilà. Je peux faire le mode panorama. Excellent. Donc, Hakim, tu peux être à l'aise pour l'anglais, français ou arabia. Donc,
thank you. Thank you. Donc, je suis anglophone plus que francophone, vu que l'expérience d'IELNA كانت في United States. So I'll try to be anglophone, شوية عربية, شوية français, making sure that we're pretty much sharing the knowledge the most efficient way possible.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. So let's talk agenda. Now that we're speaking about high availability deployment, right? It's very important to clear some definitions out of the way. خصنا ضروري نحطوا لي بوين سور لي زي كيف ما كنقولوا, cross some T's and some I's. So first thing first, we need to talk about what is deployment failure, right? شنو هو deployment failure dans un premier temps. how we learn from the deployment failures, right? Some release guidelines, applying the learnings, and finally, new approaches. So when talking about applying the learnings, we're talking about the best practices that we've managed to gather from pretty much the deployment failures that we had within the organization as an organization practice. And the new approaches, where do we see ourselves doing that? How can we add some extra mile to it? كيفاش نقدروا نزيدوا البيست براكتس مازال واحد ستيب مازال قدام ونابلايو هذا الشيء عندنا بيان سور في البايبلاينز ديالنا within the organization. So that's basically what the agenda is about. That being said, let's start with the first topic, which is what is deployment failure. Okay. All right. Now talking about deployment failure, first thing first, we want to talk what is deployment, right? We need to address the biggest elephant in the room, that is deployment. Now, if we are asking any IT person or within the organization or pretty much a team member within the DevOps team, if you're asking them to tell you about the deployment, basically, the most obvious answer would be it's a code release via CI/CD pipeline, because that's the very most often way of deployment, or that's the very most often aspect of deployment that we're having nowadays. Okay, but thinking about it and narrow it down into a very logical deduction, a deployment is pretty much is we can narrow it to any type of service change that a service team make to their services. So every single change that there is could be actually addressed as a deployment, whether it is, I would say, release software or software release or configuration release, or if we're talking about infrastructure as code, if we manage to edit some sort of code within our infrastructure, that's also a deployment, right? As you can see here, we have this mechanic here that is changing the wheel of the car. Now, he's making actually deployment to the car because he changed the wheel. It's the same concept. So even though التعريف اللي كاين عندنا حنايا الجنرال ولا التعريف اللي very often especially في المراكب ماركت هو ان الديبلويمون هو واحد I would say a software release so واحد CI/CD pipeline. That's the very common type of it, but it's far away from the general and genuine deployment definition, and it's very important to understand that in order for us to move forward with the webinar, because definition is very important, is key. Now that we've understood the deployment, right, let's move on to the next one. Right, so here are some key, I would say, example from the real world example that explain what a deployment is. All right, the deployment could be, for example, data migration. We're talking about adding a column or indexed a column within a database, or shifting a database to global configuration across different availability zones, adding standby instances and so on. That is a deployment. Scaling out or scaling in the instances fleet. If you manage to scale out or scale in the instances, that's still a deployment, right? Configuration deployment, if you're managing to configure, I would say, build specifications or deployment specifications, that's also to be considered as a deployment. Code release, which is the most common one, certification and rotation, right? If you have certifications that you want to rotate, that's also a deployment. So those are some real-world business case scenarios when talking about the deployment that we need to address here, okay? And we'll be explaining that furthermore in the webinar. Now, what is deployment failure, right? So the root cause of this webinar is how to adjust deployment failures and how to approach them. So it's only fair enough to understand them in the first place, okay? So a deployment failure is basically the most obvious answer اللي هو بديهي كيطيح لكل واحد هو deployment failure is when a deployment goes wrong, right? And it's basically the definition, the exact definition of deployment failure is I would say certain change that doesn't reach production successfully. لأن واحد لو شونجمون اللي ما وصلش لينا production successfully, that could be actually triggered as a deployment failure. But in some cases, right, in some cases, we have certain changes that didn't reach the production successfully, but still we didn't actually count them as deployment failure. And that is in the context of eliminating the customer impact that the deployment or the change has. Okay, so by introducing واحد la variable or واحد dimension that is the customer impact, the whole definition changes. Okay, so let's say that we've made a change that didn't reach the production successfully, but we've managed at early stages to roll back that deployment. as a result of early detection based on rollback alarms or CloudWatch alarms in AWS. Now that is not a failure, that is a success actually. So in order for us to deploy failure, in order for us to define failure or to take failure under consideration in terms of deployment, we need to take under consideration mainly three attributes. Okay, so deployment failure عندنا كيدفينا بثلاثة ديال لي زاتريبيو اللي هما مهمين بزاف. First thing first, the duration. For deployment to be considered as a failure, it needs to last for quite some time. For example, واحد deployment عندنا اللي بقى لنا في أقل من سكوند مثلا, that's not a deployment failure, even though changes were deployed in an appropriate way, so to speak. So duration is to be considered, to be taken under consideration. Second thing is latency, right? Now, if the deployment breaches, the latency and the performance contract. The third and last one is the core of it, اللي هو impact. If our services or our changes, so to speak, if our changes uh, manage to cause some sort of a big customer impact, right? The size of the impact matters in defining the failure. If there's no impact, even though the duration lasted there forever. For example, let's say that we've deployed some changes and they've lasted in the production before rolling back. They lasted like for 4 hours, for example, but they didn't have a concrete impact on the customer. That's not a deployment failure. So it's very important to define deployment failure in order for us to be able to solve it in different business case scenarios. So that should be an enough definition for what a deployment is and deployment failure is. Okay. Now, once we're done with this, now let's move on to how can we actually learn from deployment failures, right? If you're not learning from your own mistakes, then you're not improving. That's a common code back in the US, and I believe that's how people should work. So how can we build a robust process, organizational process, right, that would allow us to actually learn from deployment failures and apply them in future approaches, so that the team get bigger and bigger, and so that the improvement and best practices deck of the enterprise, right, or the enterprise practice, let's say for the Moviblon enterprise, gets bigger and bigger, and for the Moviblon customers, they get bigger and bigger. How can we do that? When talking about uh, applying the learning from the mistakes, there is a concept that we're following here within the company, which is a COE, right? A COE is a correction of error. So basically, correction of error is a set of reports, right, that the I would say the deployment safety group, right? We need to have a deployment safety group within the company. Those member or this team actually is responsible for creating reports, right, against customer impacts that are happening within the deployment cycle. So whenever we have some sort of a customer event or customer impact within deployment, within our deployment cycle, we need to create some sort of a correction of error reports. And in order for a report to be considered as a correction of error, it needs to contain some sort of sections, right? It's imperative that it contains some sort of sections in order to apply to the definition of correction of error. Now, first thing first, we need to list what happened, all right? So it's a quick summary about what went wrong, what exactly happened, right? Describing the scenario, describing the situation. Then we need to add supporting data and metrics. Visuals are there all the time in order for the decision makers to be able to read data. So adding supporting data and metrics to it, customer impact, you need to identify the customer impact, right? For how long it lasted, the latency of the customer impact, the type of customers that were impacted, and so on. It's very important to define that. And the most important thing here is the root cause analysis. As you can see, the root cause analysis is, I would say, the cancer cell within the pipeline or within the cycle. So the deployment safety group need to identify those root causes, right? And based on that, we need to draft some sort of lesson learned. Okay, so improvement number 1, improvement number 2, number 3, and so on. And what matters at the end of the day is the corrective actions. So you need also to elaborate on the corrective actions. What what are the steps, what are the actions to follow in order to mitigate the mistake, in order to mitigate the customer impact, right, and reduce it. So that's basically what a typical standard correction of error report should look like within the organization if we are to apply the learnings. Okay, and that's how we're conducting it within the company. Good. Now, if we are to drive some sort of a workflow here, this is where the COE actually stands within the deployment phase. Okay, so let's say that let's start with a customer impacting event. Customer impacting event, you need to drive the COE by the deployment safety group team, right? COE actions are to be taken into consideration. Once those are taken into considerations, the service team operations need to implement them within the implementation of their services or their applications, right? Until pretty much further notice, which is another customer impacting event. So that's pretty much the cycle. You need to draft the COE, you need to take action, and pretty much host meetings, right, with the operational teams, with the stakeholders, with the engineers, in order for you to spread that across the teams that are that that are pretty much concerned about the matter, and then reapply those on the pipeline. That's pretty much the cycle of correction of error. And if we are to expand that on the organizational level, because that's what matters to us, right? Because so far we're only talking about the service team, right? The team in which the error happens. But we need to actually figure out I would say, a process, right, in which the organization actually apply those learnings and the organizational as a whole thrive through it. So in order to do so, we'll be looking at something like organizational mechanism, right? So this is an organizational mechanism that we're looking at. It started with the customer impacting events, right? And for every customer impacting event that is related to every single service, a COE must be drafted as always. Now, the additional step here is to conduct a COE analysis. Now, the deployment safety group, they need to put the COE under the microscope. كيف ما كنقولوا that COE خاصو يدوز لينا خاصو يدوز بالمسطره والقلم. يعني خصنا نحطو عند واحد الميكروسكوب، خاص دار واحد deep analysis على root causes ديال هاد COEs هادو across different services, and based on that we need to define the root cause اللي هي كامل، واحد root cause اللي كتكون مشتركه ما بين ديبلومون ديال هاد لابليكاسيون، ديبلومون ديال هاد لابليكاسيون، هاد ديبلومون بروسيس، وما بين واحد الروت كوز اللي كتكون عندنا غير ديستينغويش، خاصها غير بواحد لو سيرفيس. دونك حنا كندير واحد لا ليست في داك سي او اي اناليسيس، كندير واحد لا ليست ديال روت كوزز، وكندير واحد لا ليست ديال learned lessons for each root cause based on priority. هاد لا ليست هادي هي is what we call the best practice. The best practice ديال الكومباني ولا ديال الاورجانيزيشن، right? The best practice that follows tool improvements. Okay, so we have best practice and tool improvement, and that is what this whole process is about. The process of organizational mechanism ديال COE is about extracting best practices from the previous mistakes, right? And we do that via the COE. Now, once we have that best practice, it needs to be first thing first. It needs to be shared across the different stakeholders via meetings اللي كيكونوا حاضر لينا فيهم operational managers اللي كيكونوا حاضر لينا فيهم deployment safety group, the DevOps group, the architects, and so on, so that the organization as a whole and the other team members, the other services actually benefit from our research, so to speak, right? And it becomes, once we sign on those best practices, it becomes imperative, right? It becomes part of the process and part of the deployment cycle to implement those on every single pipeline that we have within the company. Okay, and we need to make sure that the quality team, we need to put a quality team on top of it to make sure that those best practices are met within every single implementation, so that at the end of the day, the customer DLNA can feel actually relieved, and we can provide the customer with quality IT solutions. That's what the whole thing is about, and that's how we're approaching it from AWS standpoint. Now, the whole idea again behind the COE, right? We need to put that in order. The whole idea, the whole concept behind it is to prevent customer impact in future events, or even if we cannot prevent the customer impact, at least we can shrink it down and make it a bit shorter from the duration standpoint and a bit smaller from the duration standpoint. And those action items could be a change in the database settings, for example, or maybe change in the way that we're hosting or storing credentials. If we're talking about AWS, the way that we're approaching the infrastructure as a code, pretty much modification within the config maps and so on. So those changes, the idea behind them is to prevent the customer impact, because a deployment failure is tightly coupled with customer impact. If we don't have customer impact, we don't have a deployment failure at the end of the day. So we need to prevent that. If we cannot prevent it, let's make it shorter, let's make it smaller, and that is a success for us if we manage to do so. So that's basically what this whole concept is about. All right, 1 second here. Change this. There's a mistake. Yeah, it's actually the same. Okay. Okay, my apologies. Let me get back and share the screen back to it. Okay, sharing the screen. Right, please let me know if you're able to see the screen again. I'm going the panorama mode. Okay, find the learnings. All right, if you're able to see the screen, then that's okay. If you're not able to see the screen, just let me know in the chat so that I can figure out the issue for it. Now, once we're done with the how can we actually learn from the deployment failures, the most important phase for us as an organization is how can we apply the learnings, right? If you're only gathering the lessons and you don't know how to apply them, then there's no need for gathering them in the first place. So الإيديا هنايا هي شنو هما best practices that we've gathered around هذوك the previous mistakes that we have done, or the previous customer impacts that we've faced in our journey of discovering the cloud, and how we've implemented that within our pipeline, and what are the new approaches that we are targeting as well مع development team ديالنا ومع DevOps team. All right, so best practices. First thing first, integration testing. Okay, integration testing, that's the first approach that we tell our DevOps team to integrate within, to implement within our services. It must be an integration test, right? So basically, as we can see here, an integration test is you have an integration fleet, right, that load traffic against a beta endpoint. The beta endpoint, behind it, there is a beta fleet, as you can see here, and behind the beta fleet, there is beta dependency. Okay, it's very important to mention that behind the beta fleet, there is beta dependency in integration testing. So that, for example, let's say that you are testing the service, and the service, one of the components of the service is S3 or DynamoDB, for example. We're not concerned with testing S3 or DynamoDB. We're only concerned with testing the dependencies around the service itself, the dependencies that we are developing. So that's the main difference between integration testing and pre-production, and we'll see that in a bit. Okay, so just keep that schema in mind. We have the integration test fleet, running test against an endpoint in the beta, that is running test against a beta fleet, and then the beta fleet run test. Then the beta fleet is tightly coupled with a beta dependency. And another aspect, right, another best practice is pre-production testing, and it's imperative for our teams to implement that as well within their pipeline. Okay, so it's quite similar to the integration test, but there is a fine difference there if you pay attention to it. Let's talk about the original configuration test. So we have a testing fleet again that is running test against a pre-production endpoint. Now, behind the pre-production endpoint, there is the pre-production instances. Now, the pre-production fleet, behind it, there is production dependency. So that's the main difference between the pre-production testing and the integration testing, because in pre-production testing كنرانيو لي تيست على البرودكشن ديبندنسيز، ما كنرانيوش لي تيست على البيتا ديبندنسيز. سو كنضربوا ديريكتومون في البرودكشن ديبندنسيز. ماشي production fleet ولكن production dependencies, making sure that the configurations that we're about to introduce to the production phase are properly configured and properly approached and implemented. So in order for us to be able to do so, we need to conduct this setup, and it's imperative within the teams here at MoviePlan to follow the pre-production testing, basically. And after the pre-production testing, there is another best practice, which is Canary deployment. Also, it's imperative to implement that when talking about service deployment here at the company, right? It's important to implement that within the pipeline. So here in Canary deployment, we're actually deploying to a single instance within the production fleet. As you can see here, we have synthetic traffic that is driven pretty much against a pre-production, against a production endpoint. Behind the production endpoint, we have, I would say, production fleet, right? And production dependency. So we're testing against a single instance and pretty much in the production fleet. So what Canary deployment is about is mainly it's about reducing the impact of production deployment on the production fleet, simply because, as you may know, here we have, let's say we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 5 instances that are behind a load balancer, right, in the production stage. So when following the Canary deployment, we are limiting the production impact to only 20% of traffic, because the load balancer is distributing the traffic evenly on the production fleet. Now, by doing so, right, we're only limiting that impact that might be happening only to 20%. Only 20% of the production traffic is served by the Canary instance. Okay, autrement dit, غير 20% ديال داك الترافيك هو اللي كيتسيرفى لينا بديك الفيرجن الجديده اللي الديبلومون الجديد اللي دايرين، ماشي 80% الاخرى. 80% الاخرى كدوز لينا سوبل بالنسبه لي زوطخ انستانس. So another thing باش الكناري deployment ديالنا يكون standalone, for the Canary deployment to become a standalone solution in itself, a rollback alarm must be configured. Okay, so rollback alarms are very pretty much important in the Canary deployment, and we'll see why in the upcoming slides. So as you can see here, the rollback alarm is configured with the first thing first production dependency. It's linked to it. It's linked to the Canary instance. It's linked to the application load balancer, and it's linked to the synthetic traffic instances as well. At synthetic traffic instances هما اللي كيجينيريو لينا اللود تيستين بالنسبة للكناري. So that's basically what Canary deployment is about. It's about thinking about it. It's about limiting the impact of production deployment on the production fleet. So that's Canary deployment 101. Now, there are, as you can see here, هذا هو واحد الشيما ديالنا ديال deployment to production, right? And it's, although deployment to production is pretty much ما عندناش في بزاف ديال best practices, because you're already deploying to production, as you can see here في هذا السكيما هذا. Yet كنابوزاو على لي زيكيب ديالنا انهم يديروا واحد الفولو اب، انهم يديروا واحد لي كونفيغوراسيون en ce qui concerne rollback alarms. Why is that? Well, first thing first, we need to follow basically 2 rules here. The first rule is we need to configure synthetic traffic. So synthetic traffic and AI needs to be configured properly. Second rule is we need to have the rollback alarm all the time configured, even though we're talking about the production fleet. Now, why is synthetic traffic important? For mainly 2 reasons. 2 reasons why we need to have synthetic traffic configured. Simply because sometimes when we're deploying to the production fleet, right, we might be deploying at the wrong times. For example, بدنا واحد الريليس جديد ديال واحد الابليكاسيون ولكن درنا ليه ديبلومون ديالو مثلا at night, لا at midnight for example, or at early morning. Now هذاك البرودكشن فليت is not experiencing real traffic because there is low traffic في ذاك الوقت، في ذاك time zone for example, there is low traffic. Or let's say that we've pretty much we've deployed some sort of a new feature, right, within our application. That new feature ما عندوش الكاستمرز بزاف. Therefore, we cannot actually test whether it's working or not. خاصنا ضروري أننا نديروا واحد even though راه الابليكاسيون كاين عندنا في البرودكشن تيست في البرودكشن wave, sorry about that. خاصنا نديروا لها synthetic traffic. synthetic traffic اللي كيديستريبيو لينا الترافيك ديريكتومون على لي انستونس ديالنا باش ما نبقاوش كنديبونديو على الترافيك، على الريل ترافيك اللي كاين، whether it is in regards to واحد time slot, whether it is in regards to واحد feature. كنكريو الترافيك ديالنا باش to make sure 100% that everything is working fine. And of course we need to have all the time rollback alarm, because if things went crazy ولا if things went south، شي حاجه اللي واحد الايرور اوف ثينكينغ، واحد الباغ اللي وقعت، نقدروا نديروا رول باك ديك الساعه للبريفيوس فيرجن. Okay, and everything is and by doing so we are mitigating the customer impact again, and we are shrinking it and reducing it as much as possible. So those are the two key rules that we are pushing our teams to implement within their pipelines when talking about high availability deployment. All right. Now, if we are to summarize the whole process into a pipeline, basically, we'll be looking at, let's say, 4 waves, right? First wave is beta wave that has integration test driven against an integration test fleet, and then moving on to the production wave that has regional configuration test that is driven against the pre-production test fleet, sorry about that. We have the Canary wave that has soak testing driven against the Canary fleet, and we have the first wave of production, right? That has synthetic traffic again that is driven against the production wave, the production fleet. Sorry about that. Synthetic traffic that we just talked about. And before we move on, there is a very important note to keep in mind here when talking about Canary deployment. A Canary deployment should be approached in a proper way. We can go look at Canary deployment. Shouldn't be doing just a Canary deployment and move on. We need to take our time with it. كيف ما كنقولوا هنايا, we need to bake it. خصنا نعجنوا هاد الكناري deployment مزيان. So Canary deployment need to be baked for a decent amount of time. And what do we mean actually by baked is we need to set واحد amount of request per Canary deployment. كنقولوا هاد الكناري deployment phase خصها دوز لينا مثلا واحد 100,000 requests via Canary deployment in order for it to move on to the first phase of production, because you're deploying to production and you're trying to reduce and mitigate as much as possible the customer impact, so that you don't have a poor customer experience, so that you don't have to you don't have a big customer impact and breaching the contract with the customer. So it's very important to define the soak test. It's very important to take your time when implementing the Canary deployment. Take your time when executing the Canary deployment, and make sure to accurately define the number of requests that are requested, so to speak, from the Canary phase in order to move on to the production. And we need to respect that. You cannot move the production before actually signing on the whole 100,000 requests Canary-wise, because we don't play in production. So that's pretty much how we do it. So it's a very important note to take into consideration here. Even though that we've introduced a lot of best practices, right? As you can see, we have Canary, we have pretty much integration test pre-production, production, and so on. Taking into consideration the time that...
Hakim, excuse-moi, on prévoit des questions-réponses à la fin, donc
Yes.
si on peut terminer dans 10 minutes,
Okay.
Si tu peux, d'accord?
Okay.
Merci beaucoup, Hakim.
Sure. All right. So, given the time that we have a lot of time. We don't have a lot of time here, so we're gonna wrap it up quickly. So, when talking about new approaches, let's say that taking the whole practices that the best practices that we've introduced, it's about time. When talking about implementing those, it's gonna take a lot of time from the service teams to implement those within the pipelines, and that is pretty much a downside of it, right? So what we do from our side is we need to pretty much consolidate the best practices into a development tool, so that we can reduce significantly the time that could be wasted on implementing those on every single pipeline and providing new features to the service teams. So what we need to do is we need to collapse those. We need to incorporate those best practices into a deployment tool. How can we do that? That's what we'll be looking at. So basically, we're talking about fractional deployment, and that's the idea. Fractional deployment is collapsing, right? Pre-production, Canary, and Wave, for example, steps within the pipeline, collapsing them into a red box. The red box is basically what we call the deployment tool. Okay, so we need to do that in order for the service teams not to waste time on implementing those, because it's going to be a challenge for them to implement those. They're going to have a lot of questions how to do so, and we are risking human error by doing so. So it's better to control that from our way, from the experts way, and provide those to the service teams so that they can implement those seamlessly. And by doing so, we're reducing also the length of the pipeline, and that's what's going to happen. So the idea here, the thing here is quite simple. All right. So the secret is we're controlling the instance life cycle into and out of the load balancer as we're doing the deployment. So that's the secret. The secret and the deployment tool that we're having is a load balancer configured properly. So if you have a load balancer that is configured properly, you can pretty much integrate all those best practices into a single deployment tool, and that's how that's what we'll be doing in the next slides. Okay, let's see. So how are we going to drive, for example, Canary, right? How are we going to orchestrate Canary within the deployment tool? Keep in mind that this whole thing is orchestrated within the deployment tool that we just talked about. All right, so as you can see here in this video, in the Canary testing, right, if we are to deploy, or if the deployment is triggered, what's going to happen is an instance will be pretty much will be pulled out from the load balancer, right? And the deployment will happen on the level of the Canary instance, right? And once the deployment is green, then we're going to link that instance into the load balancer, and then the Canary testing will start on the instance. We'll start counting pretty much the soak test, right? The request, the 100,000 requests. Once those are cleared, then we're going to start incrementally, we're going to start introducing the new revision on the other instances of the production fleet. All this is happening while pretty much production traffic is served. So we have, technically speaking, we have zero downtime while conducting Canary testing. So again, you have pretty much a new revision, right? So we need to pull that instance from the load balancer. Once you pull that instance from the load balancer, deploy the new revision. Once you deploy the new revision, then you pull it back. You put it back to the load balancer. You start pretty much serving traffic to it, and basically here, if we're talking about load balancer, that distributes traffic evenly. We're talking about 12.5% traffic that is served to the Canary instance. And once we're done with soak testing and everything is properly done, then slowly we'll be moving to other instances and while serving the production traffic. And that's how you can get a zero downtime Canary deployment, right? While pretty much implementing the concept of deployment tool. Now let's say that Canary deployment went wrong, right? So let's say that things went south. Okay, that's what's going to happen here. All right, so we're serving the traffic and we have the Canary instance, right? So we pull up the Canary instance from the load balancer. We deploy the new revision, right? So it's green. Now we put it back to the load balancer and it starts serving the production traffic, 12.5% of it. Something happened, something resolved, right? So that's why the production or the instance is turning into a red pretty much state. Now what's going to happen is the rollback alarm is going to trigger, right? It's going to fire. And by doing that, we're going to take back the instance from the load balancer, right? Roll back the provision and get it back to the load balancer, and everything will go pretty much to its obvious or to its backward revision. And we'll give time to the service team to figure out what went wrong with that revision and get back and test it again. By doing so, we've reduced the customer impact drastically, all right? So again, it's because of the rollback and it's because of the Canary testing that we've managed to reduce that, and we've managed to have to pretty much serve the production traffic along the way in a healthy concept, I would say. Traffic shifting. All right, now when talking about traffic shifting, is adjust version, right? It's an adjust version of the Canary deployment. What do we mean by that is simply because when talking about Canary deployment, we have 8 instances here, right? And let's say that the load balancer distributes the traffic evenly. That means that the Canary instance is serving I would say 18.5% of the production traffic. Or I would say, so about that, I would say 12.5% of the production traffic, but that's still 12.5%, right? And we can actually do better than that, right? So the idea here is to configure the load balancer in a way that would allow us to actually only send 1% traffic to the Canary instance, right? So that's pretty much what we want. We need to reduce as much as possible the customer impact, right? So as you can see here, the deployment is triggered. We're pretty much updating the Canary instance, put it back to the load balancer, and then the load balancer is only distributing 1% of the traffic. And that's what we want. And we've weighted traffic on the other instances. And slowly, once we gain confidence ملي كنحسوا كاين واحد stability في الفيرجن الجديده في الكناري instance. Slowly we start pretty much incrementing the traffic من 1 5% 2 3 حتى كنوصلوا لديك الاكيليبريم اللي هو 12.5% اللي هو distributed evenly مع لي instances الاخرين. But we don't have to stop there. That's the idea. We can even نبقاو كنطلعوا في داك الترافيك شيفتين بالنسبه للكناري انستنس حتى كنوصلوا ل 50% من البريفيوس traffic that the instance was actually accepting or expecting. Why is that? Because let's say that on a best practice scenario, we have 3 availability zones, right? Now that we have 3 availability zones, البروبابيلتي ان واحد الافيلابيلتي زون طيح لا باس بها، يعني تقدر طيح لنا واحد الافيلابيلتي زون، ملي كطيح لنا availability zone we're pretty much left with 2 availability zones, and that's 50% traffic, 50% traffic. So it's imperative to test or to conduct not only Canary testing but load testing on the instance, making sure that the instance will actually survive once we have an availability zone that is down. And by doing so can cover كاع لي سيناريو وكان remedio une fois pour toutes دوك الكاستمر impact taken under consideration كاع scenarios. That's why in the first place we started with 1%, and once we gained confidence we started incrementing that حتى وصلنا 50% من the previous traffic. And once that is conducted properly كنرجعوا load balancer that is distributed evenly for production environment, and that's how we conduct traffic shifting. Now, I believe that's the last one here. So fractional deployment when talking about pre-production can also be orchestrated by the deployment tool here now. As you can remember, sorry about that. As you can remember, the pre-production, when talking about pre-production, it's basically driving traffic against the production dependencies. And if we're taking into consideration the fact that this is a Canary instance déjà هي deployée هنا في production feed, so it has dependency instances, so it has production dependencies, and that's what we want. So une fois كان déclencher واحد pre-production scenario within a deployment tool ديالنا, what it does is basically we provision a load balancer, as you can see here. So a load balancer is provisioned, and the Canary instance, once we upgrade the Canary instance to the new release, it's linked to the, as you can see here in the picture, it's in the video, it's linked to the new load balancer. And the load balancers start distributing pretty much integration tests against that Canary instance. And by doing so, you're conducting pre-production testing. Now, once the pre-production testing is done and pretty much the test report is green, we can pretty much put that back into the original load balancer. And by doing so, you can move on من بعد pre-production Canary and traffic shifting. And by doing so, شنو درنا دابا حنايا؟ شدينا دوك pre-production testing, Canary testing, and pretty much traffic testing as well as load testing. شديناهم جمعناهم كاملين في واحد الريد بوكس اللي هو deployment tool ديالنا اللي هو basically it's customizing the load balancer in such ways that would allow us to automate the whole thing and to minimize the pipeline and to reduce the work على service teams ديالنا, while making sure that the best practices are to be met within every single deployment. So that's pretty much what we've done here. Yeah, I believe with that being said, we've reached the end of the presentation. Thank you all for listening, and it is time for you guys to ask us questions and pretty much provide us with your feedback, what you think about the webinar, and pretty much les questions اللي كاينين عندكم en termes ديال high availability, en termes ديال AWS generally speaking. We'll be more than happy to provide you with answers here. Thank you. I'm going to mute myself. Okay, بالنسبة Leila, can you please tell me if there are any questions so that I can answer them?
Hakim, merci beaucoup. Donc, il y a pas mal de questions. Donc, il y a beaucoup de remerciements. Donc,
Thank you.
On va passer les questions. Donc, voilà. Donc, la première question.
Okay, so first question is, شنو هي la différence between Canary deployment and blue-green deployment? That's a good question. First thing first, the main difference is when talking about Canary deployment, think of it like this. كنقولوا في Canary deployment, in the first 10 minutes, for example, or the first واحد لا بيريود اللي كنحددو, traffic غادي يبقى كيتشيفت علينا ب 10% مثلا للكناري instance. Once ديك 10 minutes اللي هي calculated based on the number of the soak tests ولا هو based on the number of the requests, once هذيك 10 minutes is done, then the whole production traffic غادي يبدا كيضرب لينا في ديك الكناري instance. That's the difference. So عندنا واحد 10 minutes lapse ولا 5 minutes lapse ولا واحد لا ديوغي اللي كنحددو حنايا عاوتاني اللي فيها كنديروا واحد fractional deployment. Une fois كتسالي ديك لا بيريود, we go bullish on ديك الكناري instance, كنعطيو ليها ديك الويت اللي كيتعطى لي انستانس الاخرين. Now in the blue-green deployment, it's different. So for blue-green deployment, we're looking at two target groups. Target group load, target group 10. Both of them are linked to, I would say, an application load balancer. And what we're doing here is every single time, I would say كاين عندنا جوج ديال لي variable, the amount of traffic and the duration. So we're saying basically within every 5 minutes, let's deploy 10 minutes of production traffic لهاد التارجت جروب هذا حتى كيوصل لنا ل 100%. حتى كيوصل لنا ل 100% وكيبقى لنا واحد المده في 100%. عاد ديك الساعه حنايا كنديسترويو داك الاوريجينال تارجت جروب وكنبقاو في داك الجرين ديبلويمنت. Okay, so that's blue green. So blue green deployment is basically gradually moving. يعني كل دقيقه ولا كل واحد لا بيريود اللي هي ديتيرميني كنحطوا واحد الاماونت ديال اللي هو صاب لواحد الاماونت اللي كنحدو في الاول اللي هو صاب, كنبقاو كنحطوه كيتزاد لينا شويه بشويه, يمكن مانتلي كيتزاد لينا في الانفايرمنت الاخرى حتى كنريتشيو داك الايكيليبريوم ديال 100%. Once we reach that, then we're good to go, and pretty much you can destroy the previous provision. So that's the answer to the first one, the first question. Any other questions? So most simple, straightforward way to implement a blue-green deployment environment in AWS. Well, when talking about most straightforward way, all the time we can go to most straightforward, simple. We're talking about serverless approach, okay? ملي كنهضروا في serverless approach هنا في AWS نقدروا نهضروا على Fargate, right? So if we are to create واحد Fargate cluster, the Fargate cluster is implicitement كيتكونيكت لنا مع واحد الابليكيشن لود بالانسر واللي كيسبورت لنا البلو جرين deployment. So هذه by definition it's there. يعني it's very simple, very straightforward. So you can have first thing first an AWS code pipeline process in place. شنو كاين هنا في AWS code pipeline process? We have code commit كنحطو في الريبوزيتوري ديالنا. We have code build اللي كيدير لنا البيلد كيدير لنا تيست ديال داكشي اللي درنا وكيخرج لنا واحد الارتيفاكتس كنليهم لينا الكود ديبلوي. code deploy is configured باش انه يديبلوي لينا في Fargate which is a serverless cluster. Okay, serverless configuration. You don't have to worry about EC2 داكشي كامل. We don't have to worry about it. We only have to worry about côté matière. So الcode deploy هو فين كنكونفيغوريو البلو جرين deployment وكنكونفيغوريو البلو جرين deployment also في الفارغيت والفارغيت باي ديفينيشن اون فوا كنكريو كيولي واحد الابليكيشن لود بالانسر باي دوين سو سيمليسلي كتولي لنا واحد البلو جرين deployment situation. So that's pretty much the answer. You have Fargate, code pipeline, application load balancer. Which users to invite to Canary release? I don't get the question. Which users in terms of roles, or in terms of AWS identity access management. إلا اخترت يا سي صمد إلابوري لينا على لا كيسيون également. Yes, that is correct. Canary deployment enables us to test الابليكاسيون ديالنا for production. However, it limits كيف ما قلنا كتليميتي لينا الامباكت ديال داك الديبلويمنت على البرودكشن فليت حيت كتكون عندنا واحد الكناري ديبلويمنت كتكون عندنا واحد الكناري انستنس بيسيكلي هي الوحيده اللي كيدوز لها واحد البورسونتاج ديال البرودكشن ترافيك so that you can test against the production configuration, the production dependencies, and so on. So it's very important to mention that. Yeah. كيضرب لينا directly for production. We call it a production testing basically. Right. So what I understand here is a COO, correction of error, right? And شنو exactement COO in terms of business or in terms of technically speaking, I don't get the concept of a COO. All right, so CDN in AWS is basically content delivery network, okay? And when talking about content delivery network, we're talking about the replicate. We're talking about basically, if we get to know CDN, content delivery network, we're talking about caching systems, and we're talking about static files. Now, when talking about caching system and static file, the CDN is the replication ديال دوك replication ديال دوك static files اللي هما mostly speaking كيكونوا S3 buckets. If we're talking about AWS, the replication of those across regional endpoints اللي هما عبارة على واحد الكاشين systems ولا الكاشين servers غالبا كتكون Redis. Okay, so we have static files that are replicated on different caching servers across the globe. Okay, and the most important service in the most important AWS service to be concerned about CDN هو CloudFormation. AWS CloudFormation is هو السيرفيس اللي كنقادو فيه الامور هادو في AWS. Now back to la question ديال Rehab. هنايا عندنا CEO is Chief Operations Officer. There's a whole total different because I'm also Chief Operations Officer in the company. A COE, okay? COE is a concept, technical concept, okay? So COE هو technical concept ديال applying the learnings, yeah? يعني correction of errors. That's ديال la définition ديال COE. ولكن la définition ديال COE is a Chief Operations Officer is someone in upper management or a stakeholder that is in charge of pretty much applying the strategies that are delivered by the CEO. Okay, so هذا هو COO in terms of business, but COE is tightly coupled with technical understanding ومع technical pipelines ديالنا. So a COE is basically les rapports اللي كتخرج واحد ليكيب ديال ديبلوامون سيفتي جروب اللي كتخرج based on ولا against كل ايفنت اللي كيوقع لينا في الشركه واحد ديبلويمنت فيها اللي كيوقع هما مسؤولين انهم يخرجوا لنا واحد سي او اي وكنستوري دوك السي او اي في الاتلاسين باغ اكزومبل وداك السي او اي كامل كنديروا عليهم واحد سبرينت ديمو فور اكزامبل so that other teams can actually implement هذوك practices and be aware of those practices وكان communicate دوك practices للquality department باش الquality department to make sure بلي امبوزيهم دونك هادي هي لا ديفيرونس والسي او او راه شخص بذاته. when not to use Canary deployment. If you don't have, you shouldn't use Canary deployment if you don't have a rollback alarm. That's for sure. إلا ما كانش عندك واحد rollback alarm set in place configured properly ولا واحد anomaly detection كيتسمى واحد anomaly detection in place via CloudWatch par exemple, you cannot do Canary deployment. حيت I give you a scenario غادي ندير واحد الكناري deployment في واحد الانستانس و it's not gonna go well. يعني customers will experience some degraded experience, okay? And انت كوميطون واحد DevOps engineer ما غاديش يكون عندك visibility, okay? حيت ما عندكش rollback alarm. rollback alarm won't be triggered, meaning that ديك الفيرجن غادي تبقى خدام even though ديك الفيرجن provide واحد deployment failure. So we should never do that. So that's pretty much it.
Très bien, très bien. Ben, je pense qu'on a fait le tour et on a répondu à l'ensemble des questions. Je remercie tout le monde donc, d'avoir assisté. Merci beaucoup, Sir Hakim.
Thank you so much.
Et ce n'est qu'un début pour une série de webinaires AWS. Donc, Inch'Allah, le prochain dans 2 semaines.
Inch'Allah, yep.
Donc, merci tout le monde et au nom de toute l'équipe Moby Blanc également, je vous remercie et à très bientôt, Inch'Allah. Merci
Inshallah.
beaucoup.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Salam alaikum.
Yusuf. Thank you everyone for joining and inshallah تكونوا استفدتوا معنا في some best practices اللي نقدروا ناخذوهم في الكلاود جورني ديالكم ولا تجونيونا حنايا في موبي بلان او سي باش نورغانيزيوهم together. And see you in the next webinar, inshallah. Thank you.
Inch'Allah.
Be safe.
Merci beaucoup. Assalamu
Bye.
alaikum. Au revoir.
Bye.
Bye.